All right, let's jump right into this explainer of David Graeber and David Wingrove's mind-bending book, The Dawn of Everything. Today, we're essentially going to completely rewire how we think about human history. We look at the absolute mess of the modern world and can't help but wonder, are we just inherently selfish? Did something go fundamentally wrong way back in our past? Well, we're going to explore why those might actually be the completely wrong questions to ask. It's a classic philosophical trap, right? Are humans innately good, or are we innately evil? We're all so deeply familiar with the standard stories we've been spoon-fed. It's always either, hey, we fell from some beautiful Garden of Eden state of childlike innocence, or we were saved from a bloody, brutal survival of the fittest nightmare by the magical invention of modern civilization. We basically treat these as our only two options. But here's the kicker, and this is the author's core premise. Arguing about this is completely missing the point. The source material points out that good and evil are just human concepts, right? Things we literally made up to compare ourselves to one another. So asking if humans are inherently good or evil makes about as much sense as asking if we are fundamentally fat or thin. It's a totally false premise. And worse, it traps our historical imagination and severely limits what we think is even possible for our future. Let's move straight into Section 1, the myth of humanity's childhood. To understand why we're asking the wrong questions today, we really have to look back at the guys who essentially wrote the script for how we view our past. Take Thomas Hobbes. Way back in 1651, he argued that humanity's original state of nature was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Basically, a perpetual war of everybody fighting against everybody else. Hobbes thought we absolutely needed police, governments, and heavy bureaucracy just to save us from our own base instincts. Now contrast that with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. His story flips it. He said we started as these innocent, egalitarian hunter-gatherers, but then agriculture and cities came along and ruined the whole shebang, bringing in inequality and state oppression. So we're taught this very rigid binary. We're either selfish savages saved by the state or innocent foragers ruined by civilization. But reducing our incredibly complex ancestors to two-dimensional cardboard cutouts isn't just factually wrong, it literally depresses our political imagination. The authors argue there are three massive problems with this false choice. Number one, they simply aren't true. Modern evidence shows a past bursting with vibrant, complex social experiments. Number two, they have dire political implications. I mean, if we believe inequality is just the unavoidable price of living in a complex society, we completely stop trying to imagine better alternatives. And number three, honestly, they just make the past needlessly dull. Which brings us to Section 2, Hobbes versus Rousseau. We really need to stop treating these philosophical thought experiments as cold, hard historical facts. Because, incredibly, modern historians and psychologists actually still treat them as facts today. Look at this quote from Rousseau himself. He explicitly says, "One must not take the kind of research which we enter into as the pursuit of truths of history, but solely as hypothetical and conditional reasonings." He was exploring a philosophical paradox about freedom and inequality, not writing an archaeological textbook. Even Rousseau openly admitted he was essentially writing historical fan fiction. Yet somehow modern thinkers have taken these completely hypothetical scenarios and built our entire modern understanding of social evolution right on top of them. And there's this amazing documented historical pattern from the colonial Americas that turns that whole Hobbesian idea of civilized superiority completely on its head. It's called the defector phenomenon. When Europeans were captured or adopted by Native American societies, they were often eventually given the choice to go back to Europe. But as Benjamin Franklin himself observed, these folks almost always chose to stay with their indigenous adoptive families. If they were forced or ransomed back to civilization, they were usually totally disgusted by the European way of life and would escape back to the woods at the literal first opportunity. And on the flip side, Native Americans incorporated into European society almost never wanted to stay. That really tells you something, doesn't it? Let's dive into Section 3, the Indigenous Critique. So, if these European stories of humanity's childhood are just made-up myths, and if Europeans themselves clearly preferred living in indigenous societies when given the chance, we have to look elsewhere for the spark that actually ignited our modern ideals of freedom. Have you ever wondered where 18th century European intellectuals suddenly got the bright idea that human beings should be equal? Because before that, back in the Middle Ages, the whole concept of social equality literally did not exist in European thought. Everyone just assumed ranks and strict hierarchies were perfectly natural. So where in the world did this radical shift in thinking actually come from? The massive twist in this explainer is that, according to the source material, it came straight from Native American intellectuals who were actively debating and dismantling European values. Early French missionaries and settlers in North America were engaging in these deep, intense philosophical debates with indigenous leaders. And through these conversations, indigenous thinkers formulated an incredibly sharp, consistent critique of European society. They focused heavily on Europe's absolute lack of freedom, their stunning lack of mutual care, and what seemed to Native Americans like a completely baffling, almost pathetic subservience to arbitrary authority. Let's look at exactly what they were seeing. Observers from the Wendat and Mi'kmaq nations looked at these French colonists and basically saw a chaotic, selfish society where people were just scrambling over each other, hoarding wealth while their actual neighbors starved to death. They noted the French were constantly quarreling and slandering each other. And they were absolutely appalled that the French would just let needy beggars starve in the streets without offering any charity. That was a concept completely unheard of in Wendat towns, where hospitality was freely given to everyone. They also noticed the French blindly obeyed their captains out of pure fear. Oh, and in conversation, they interrupted each other constantly, completely lacking the basic eloquence and respect that was standard in indigenous public councils. Moving right along to Section 4, the shock of true liberty. Now, when European colonizers encountered societies built on genuine, actual freedom, they were utterly baffled by it. Just listen to this quote from Father Lalemant, a 17th century Jesuit priest, describing the Wendat. He is clearly astonished that they never submit to any laws and obey no other impulse than that of their own will. To the Jesuits, who firmly believed freedom was inherently wicked and animalistic, this was downright scandalous. Yet even Lalemant had to admit, somewhat begrudgingly, that this society actually functioned with way less disorder than France did. The contrast between these two worldviews was staggering. While Europeans relied heavily on subjugation, punishing criminals, and this intense, ingrained fear of authority, indigenous societies operated on a completely different paradigm. Justice wasn't about punishing a single guilty person. It was about the entire clan paying compensation to the victim's family. It created this collective responsibility to keep the peace. Chiefs couldn't force anyone to do anything. They had to rely purely on eloquence and persuasion. They deeply prioritized the freedom to debate, the freedom to disobey, and the freedom to care for one another, all without the threat of a ruler using force. So the crucial takeaway here is this massive paradigm shift in how we actually define equality. Over in Europe, when the concept finally started to bubble up, equality meant equality before the sovereign or the law. Basically, everyone was equally subjugated to a higher power. But indigenous equality was an entirely different beast. It was the equal freedom to disobey. You were equal because literally no adult could be forced by any other adult to do something against their will. It was this radical, indigenous concept of freedom that was carried back to Europe in best-selling missionary travel logs, utterly shocking European intellectuals and literally planting the seeds for the Enlightenment. Which brings us to our final and perhaps most important question of this whole explainer. What if human history isn't some tragic fall from grace, but rather a story of forgotten possibilities? The authors suggest that instead of asking how we lost our equality in some mythical past, a past that, as we've seen, never actually existed, we should be asking a much deeper question. How did we get so stuck? How did we become trapped in such tight conceptual shackles that we literally forgot how to reinvent our own societies? Our ancestors spent tens of thousands of years playfully experimenting with completely different ways to live. So, what is stopping us from imagining something completely new today?